Islands and archipelagos make up some of the earliest colonies in the modern era. Is it their sexy, remote appeal that lures empire into seeking paradise within their coasts? Or is that just historical marketing? Could the pattern of colonizing islands perhaps be a bit more sinister, more targeted and rooted in extractive scheming that gets spread to larger populations after its practice on these more vulnerable communities? Out of 11,000 known inhabitable islands, 4 have famously never been colonized: Japan, Tonga, North Sentinel Island in India, and Devon Island in Canada, which the latter of which is technically uninhabitable, so I guess that makes 3. Many islands have been colonized more than once. Indonesia, for example, which is technically comprised of 17,000 islands, of which only 6,000 are habitable, and technically only 922 of its islands have permanent, continuous populations, was colonized 3 times, first by the Dutch, then the British, then Japan, until reaching independence in 1945. Several other islands have gained sovereignty in the last few hundred years. So that's 36, give or take, that are currently not colonized. And out of those, many have been conquered before, but then fought for independence. So the question is, why are islands ideal ecosystems for colonization? Well, obviously, they're already isolated, which means they have no neighboring potential allies. They provide a controlled study of how to take over a land and rule over a people by limiting and monitoring resources, specifically via exports and imports. So basically, they're vulnerable yet rich in assets. Archipelagos are powerful yet defenseless and provide perfect conditions to experiment with domination via colonization. UNESCO defines colonization as the act or process of a foreign power taking control of a territory, usually by establishing settlements and subjugating the indigenous population. It involves the political, economic, and cultural domination of a region to extract resources and expand the ruling country's power. The steps of colonization follow several patterns: cut off access to land and food sovereignty from local inhabitants, impose population control through various means like displacement, dissemination, disenfranchisement, and even deathly conditions, force labor, typically through roles of service, and ensure underrepresentation even when the colonized are integrated into, quote-unquote, democracy. Throughout history, these tactics were more overt and violent: genocide, famine, slavery, sterilization. And these practices aren't limited to islands alone. Are islands actually gateways or footholds in the grander scheme of modern capitalism? Islands have rich biodiversity and natural resources. They provide strategic placement throughout the world for ruling empires. They are practice grounds for militarization and imprisonment. But now a resurgence of colonization has arrived yet again, veiled through luxury rebranding. There are many islands protesting luxury resident developments right now in 2026. Puerto Rico, Sazan Island, the Canary Islands, Aruba, Assumption Island, the Balearic Islands, Barbuda, Jamaica, Grenada. These luxury settlements throughout these islands are signaling a new wave of colonization and ownership. Privatizing coastlines insulates people, restricts their access to imports, denationalizes resources, and enforces servicial labor onto remaining populations, trapping them through debt while providing tax incentives to the wealthy, who extract the luxury of the land without fair taxation going back into the islands. Islands are already remote, and they are intrinsically luxurious: breezy beaches, rare wildlife, lush flora and fauna, delicious indulgences, typically available to inhabitants and visitors. But extractive luxury, is sold through opulent exclusivity. And there is no exclusivity without limiting access to these natural resources by creating barriers that never existed prior. How are new luxury settlements much different from the conquerors of old? These developments mimic the dark roots of an imperial practice, an approach empires use to take over a concentrated place, ostracize its existing people from access to resource, with application of varied degrees of ecological genocide to the biodiversity within natural habitats that disenfranchises the locals to the extent that many leave or remain and survive through service, hospitality, and tourism. Jobs not designed by locals, but instead made necessary by these settlements. So in basic terms, the objective of these elite settlements repeats the colonial pattern. First, occupy through construction that displaces current populations and makes the land desolate. Build highly unaffordable infrastructure that makes access exclusive for the elitely wealthy. Capitalizing on land that targets insular people may seem like none of your business, especially if you have no connection to these lands culturally or physically. But what if this approach is practiced on a controlled population to then be applied to the masses? Is gentrification of an entire island dissimilar to what happens across communities? And what are the ecological ramifications? Who is to say that the biodiversity of these islands does not serve a global purpose? These tactics are practice for elite powers to rehearse domination under global permission. Will other people fight for the rights of a population separated from them by water? And who is to say that these colonial practices end with islanders? Ironically, the colonization is twofold. It also isolates wealthy patrons in their privilege while luring them away from any real community, reinforcing the belief that it is better to be alone and trapped within luxury than to be a people or community within a mutually beneficial ecosystem of shared resources and purpose. Weren't the original U.S. colonies promised religious freedom and personal paradise when new settlers were actually still ruled by the king? Who does it ultimately benefit if we don't fight against this imperial practice? Several companies and elites own islands. The Royal Caribbean Group owns multiple islands in the Bahamas and Haiti. Carnival Cruise Line owns Half Moon Cay, operates the Princess Cays, and Celebration Key in the Bahamas. The Disney Cruise Line owns Castaway Cay and Lookout Cay at Lighthouse Point in the Bahamas. The Norwegian Cruise Line owns Great Stirrup Cay in the Bahamas and Harvest Cay in Belize. MSC Cruises owns the Ocean Cay MSC Marine Reserve in the Bahamas. Meliá Hotels International previously acquired properties in Cayo Coco in Cuba to anchor large-scale resort complexes. LVMH, Moet Hennessy Louis Vuitton, CEO Bernard Arnault, owns Indigo Islands in the Bahamas. Red Bull owns Kokomo Private Island Resort in Fiji. Virgin Group owns Necker Islands in the British Virgin Islands. While it's primarily a personal retreat for founder Richard Branson, it operates as a high-end luxury resort managed by the Virgin Limited Edition Company, which segues us into individually owned islands. Larry Ellison owns approximately 98% of the Hawaiian island of Lanai. David Copperfield owns the islands of Copperfield Bay in the Bahamas. Johnny Depp owns Little Halls Pond Cay, a 45-acre island in the Bahamas. Mel Gibson owns Mago Island in Fiji. Mark Zuckerberg owns a massive sprawling compound on the Hawaiian island of Kauai, which is heavily fortified and spans hundreds of acres. Sounds like a kingdom of one, plus whoever serves to maintain it. These islands are literal metaphors for what's happening within society at large. Abundance exists for a select few who can afford it, even though that abundance existed more accessibly before the divisions of settler colonialism. Islands are still mostly colonies and territories, 75% of islands are not sovereign. But colonization doesn't end with islands. Neighborhoods can be treated like islands. Races can be treated like islands. Tax brackets are archipelagos, affording only a few with survival. Many servicial populations living in food deserts and neglected infrastructure are like proverbial islands. Are populations beyond islands currently colonized? How do communities get separated and spread across the world if not by the same entities colonizing their homelands? The same authorities who ironically shame migration while enforcing it through disenfranchisement. And why aren't we challenging these practices? Puerto Rico and many populations of island descent remain a threat to the colonized status quo that many communities have already accepted. Puerto Rico's land functions as a commons to the diaspora and native inhabitants, with its connective power still thriving while threatened by the continual colonial project. What is a commons? A commons, or the commons, is an umbrella term for shared resources, spaces, or social practices that are collectively managed by a community rather than by the state or private corporations. It functions as an active social system, typically rooted in place or land, literal physical community, and requires members of said community to actively participate, self-govern, and devise their own rules for sharing. Land used to be what people had in common, what they shared memories with, what they collectively adored and cared after. An elite, violent few have deemed land as exclusive property that no one common should share, and the privatization of land has made common third spaces more and more rare, essentially locking people into invisible caste systems of limited public access. But more about that in another video. Join the island fight for sovereignty through these lists of petitions and organizations. Help preserve Puerto Rico's previously protected lands in Cabo Rojo. And please like and subscribe to The People's Analyst, a media experiment aimed at connecting the dots between vital information about the historical roots of power, democracy, and subjugation with potential modern solutions.